Everybody, welcome back. The last two lessons we talked a little bit about a important model in macroeconomics, which is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And essentially, we saw that you can use an ADAS model in order to show the performance of an economy at various points in time and link together important macroeconomic variables such as unemployment, GDP, and inflation or price levels. The goal for introducing that model hadn't been to just sort of introduce a layer of theoretical abstraction into your understanding of the economy, but also to give you a tool that you can use to have a little bit greater understanding of policy discussions that governments have as they try to manage an economy. And today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at one major way that government tries to sort of drive policy on an economic level, and that will involve what we call fiscal policy. And fiscal policy, it's an important tool set, and it's also a tool set that government, especially in times of emergencies like what we're going through right now, will actually lean quite heavily upon in order to try to right the ship of an economy that may not be going the direction that the government wants it to. To start off with, I wanted to review something that you're already probably familiar with from other courses or just your general understanding of an economy, and that's something we refer to as the business cycle. The business cycle is essentially a graph which shows us how the economy grows over time, particularly within a capitalist system. You'll notice that in any economy, you generally will tend to, and you can see this here, see growth as a trend. And the reason for that is logical. So long as you don't have catastrophic events occurring that destroy your sort of productive capacity, over time people become more knowledgeable, they find new resources, new people and new ideas are added to the economy, and the general result of that is that GDP will benefit, and there'll be more GDP over the long term than there would have been, of course, many years in the past. The business cycle, though, illustrates not only the trend, but also the fact that, and this is really more the actual day-to-day of the cycle, while we tend to grow over time, it's not a perfect straight line trajectory upwards. But rather, what tends to happen is that the economy tends to ebb and flow. You'll have some periods where there'll be considerable growth, considerable boom within the economy will occur, where you'll have lots of spending, lots of optimism, and really a great picture. We call those things peaks. But you also will sometimes have slowdowns where that growth will be interrupted by a period where spending starts to decline, production may not quite hit its peak, and may actually be far under what it can be, and you start to deal with either a recession or, in some really dramatic situations, perhaps even depression, where there's a decline that occurs. The declines are never endless. They often will sort of correct themselves over time. The key idea of the business cycle, though, is the fact that you will go through those different periods, and that while growth will usually occur over the long run, the pathway towards that will be uneven. A question that's often asked, it's an important philosophical question both in the past as well as today for an economy, is given that the business cycle occurs, and it's more or less a given in the capitalist economy, you will go through this trend even if government stays out of the picture. How much should government try to intervene with things? How should a government respond in times of economic slowdown? And secondly, should a government really step in if there's a situation where things are not ideal? And you can see these points here, knowing that there's almost inevitability that at some point you will see a growth period again, and that cycle is just sort of a naturally occurring phenomenon. For many years, the answer to this question was essentially that given that the economy self-regulates, there's no benefit for government stepping in. If you look at classical economists from the 1770s onwards into the 19th century, such as David Ricardo and Adam Smith, here you can see him with his 1770s-esque Beats headphones on, the argument was that don't interrupt something that naturally will be good over the long term. In particular, they argued that while the economy can't grow forever without some readjustment, in other words, if there's too much growth, there will be high prices, people start to become skeptical, and eventually people will pull back and maybe sort of pull their money out for a time being. Typically speaking, those sort of periods of decline will actually create the roots for growth in the future, because as decline occurs, prices will decline. Opportunities for investment will become perhaps a little bit more lucrative as people look at situations, see low prices, and say, hey, there's an opportunity to invest. maybe we should. And then as that starts to occur, the economy will pick itself up over the long term. In particular, their argument was that there would be self-regulation and that those declines that occur periodically are not necessarily fun. Nobody likes to go through a recession, but that the best response is to not panic, not to sort of over accommodate, but rather just to sort of ride out that wave and wait for a better time. Because you know, based on historical sort of patterns and precedents, that inevitably that better time will be coming in the future. It's almost in a certain way, and I made this aside today, just added it to the lesson, kind of like the traditional sort of predator and prey models you might have heard about in a biology class. And essentially the idea with those would be this. If you ever look at a sort of environment where you have a predator, a fox, and prey, let's say a bunny, they'll naturally kind of regulate each other's population numbers. If you get to a point where bunnies are doing too well and there's too many bunnies and you have sort of bunnies everywhere, you don't have to worry about being inundated by an endless supply of bunnies that will never run out, because what will eventually happen is that the foxes in the area, which may be a sort of a low number for a period of time, they'll see all those bunnies, they'll see a perfect opportunity for dinner, they'll eat, they'll multiply at a much faster rate than usual, and as they grow in numbers, the bunnies will actually start to become more and more endangered than they had been in the past, because of course their predator is sort of superseded. Now, similarly, will you have to worry about being inundated by foxes? Well, no, because as the bunnies all get eaten, the food supply for the foxes will decline, and then eventually you'll have a situation wherein, with not enough bunnies to eat, foxes will slowly start to die off, bunnies will start to rise back up. And again, there's kind of sort of a give and take. It's a constant sort of change in population for both the bunnies and the foxes, but inevitably they will each cause for the sort of cycle to work the way it's supposed to. I guess another sort of small aside, if you ever see things like, for example, spiders in your house, there's often a tendency, oh, get rid of that ugly spider, I don't want that. But most biologists would actually argue spiders are really useful because they're a prey for a lot of other insects and things that you don't want in your house. And in fact, if you leave them and you let them kind of crawl off into their corner, they'll actually do a lot of work for you in terms of cleaning out a lot of other really more negative things that you might have in terms of microorganisms within your particular household. Anyways, coming back to sort of the idea of the business cycle, the classical argument of people like David Ricardo and Adam Smith have been, don't do anything, stand back, let the economy run itself. That theory, though, was an easy theory for a wealthy person to make because, of course, they had means to survive if things were poor. And one of the criticisms that had always existed is that, well, when you have those 3 or 4 year really deep recessions or perhaps even depressions, and they did occur in the 19th century quite regularly, how does a person who doesn't have a lot of money deal with that? And is it fair for a person to just be told to ride something out when they don't really have a lot of means by which to do that with? The theory of classical economics didn't really, though, outside of those small pockets of criticism, which of course led to things like socialism, it didn't have a huge real pullback because the economy generally did pretty well throughout most of the 19th century. And most of those bad years, they were accompanied by very, very good years. And people tended to just believe that, okay, well, this idea of staying out of an economy is working. Why fix something that's, ultimately going to lead to long-term gains? Where thinking really happened primarily across the Western world in the 1920s and early 1930s. And the reason why thinking changed, as I'm sure you're aware, was that there was an event that occurred called the Great Depression. Essentially, you had a downturn. 1929, in particular, New York City, you had a stock market collapse. It triggered a number of people who'd bought stocks on the margins, which essentially meant that they bought those stocks on credit to start to panic because they didn't have the money to pay off. There was a domino effect downwards, and essentially you ended up not just in a recession, but in a deep one that actually became a depression. The challenge of the classical theory, though, was this. The economists had argued, well, don't worry, it's just a worse version of what we've seen in the past. Eventually, things will pick itself up in terms of the economy and things will get better. But as you started to push into the 1930s, 1931, 1932, 1933, And the actual trajectory did not pick back up, but in fact continued to slide downwards as more negativity built more negativity into the system. People started looking for new answers. And essentially, a lot of people started to maybe question, can capitalism survive? Is there any sort of way that we can push through with a system that doesn't seem to be able to fix itself? One man in particular led that sort of crusade for a new way of thinking. His way of thinking was actually very important because while it didn't necessarily challenge all of capitalist thinking, he certainly didn't want to see an end to sort of the general principles of a free market. There was a notion that perhaps there needs to be a little bit of intervention in these crisis type periods, and that perhaps there is a role for government to play in a modern economy. You may or may not know, but the name of that man who led to a number of those changes was John Maynard Keynes. And I'll come back to him in a second. I'd forgotten about this graph, but I'll just sort of quickly go through. Again, you can see the business cycle throughout most of the 19th century. It had its dips. Certainly in 1873, for example, there was a major period of collapse. 1830s, there was a major one, at least in the West. But 1930, 31, 32, 33, it was worse than anybody had seen before. And the pickup after that was quite light. They didn't get the sort of rebound they were hoping for. That led to a lot of people looking for a very new way of looking at the economy. And it really created a perfect climate for people like Keynes and what became his Keynesian theory to start to become quite popular, both with individuals as well as with governments around the world. Keynes was a British economist born in Cambridge in 1883. He was certainly a man who'd had a wealthy background himself and was definitely part of sort of the elite within society. He was a little bit different, though. He was definitely a little bit more sort of a creative thinker, a little bit of an outsider for his period. And his theories that he developed as he started to look at the economy during this period, they actually became some of the most important theories really put out into economic thinking over the past 125 years. What stands out the most and what we're going to look at in terms of his thinking today is his argument, which was today taken for granted, but at the time quite revolutionary, that government should get involved in the economy. He claimed that classical economic policies and laissez-faire were flawed. They didn't take into account the human needs of populations in times of trouble. And his argument was that, well, government is one of the few actors in the economy that can really take hold of things during a period of emergency. And thus, there is actually a role for government to play. And the idea of laissez-faire, hold your hands back and don't get involved within the economy, was a flawed way of thinking. To explain Keynes's theories, we do have to kind of talk a little bit about a couple of his ideas. One of the most important things he argued was that the business cycle was not just a static thing that you couldn't intervene with it, but that rather governments could and should actually intervene within the cycle to try to stabilize those sort of up and down periods. If you think about the business cycle like a roller coaster, he argued you don't necessarily have to have your economy like a roller coaster where there's steep inclines and steep declines and it's constantly oscillating. There can be an opportunity for the government to kind of smooth things out so that that ride is not necessarily so scary and it's a little bit easier for people to go through as they sort of participate in their daily lives. In particular, Keynes suggested that government can use powers of spending and taxation in order to smooth out the business cycle. And his claim was that by using those powers, those levers that government had available to them, they could make for a much better economy overall. Part of his theories essentially relied on the idea that money or GDP is sort of a static level that's determined by the amount of money circulating within the economy. But that while it's static in the fixed time frame of today, over time, the GDP will move. And the reason why that GDP level will move over time is that there are things that tend to push the GDP up and things that tend to push the GDP down. And they're constantly changing the overlying base level. He referred to things that would take money out of the economy as leakages. And essentially, he said that that was anything, either intentional policy or unintentional policy, that would cause for the GDP to lower. So, for example, if you charge taxes, it would take money out of the economy. If people save more money than they used to do, then it would take money out because there'd be less consumption. If imports rose, then money would be leaving the overall model. The other thing he referred to, of course, is sort of the counterbalance, which is injections. And he said that injections, again, can be intentional reciprocal, or sometimes they can be automatic, but essentially they involve situations where money is being put back into the overall level of the GDP, whether it's through government spending, intentional government spending, investment spending by businesses, or exports. The key idea is that the more of that, the higher the overall base level of your economy will be. And the combination of injections and leakages will determine the overall sort of level that your GDP has at any one point in time. You can look this over a little bit if you get a chance. It's probably not something that's really critical, but it gives you an idea that when you look at your economy, and this is that circular flow model we talked about a couple of months ago, if you add back in things like, for example, government and investment and exports, then there's new layers of sort of injections and leakages that can also sort of alter the overall picture. I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail. It's not going to be something that's worth it for now, but you can take a quick peek if you're interested as you read through your book tonight. What I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about today is how that idea of leakages and injections led to an analogy, which is a pretty simple but important one that Keynes had for an economy. He said that the economy is kind of like a bathtub, in that you want your tub to have enough water that you're comfortable, but not so much water that there's a risk that if somebody gets into that tub, it's going to spill over and create a whole range of challenges. Essentially, he argued that part of the way that you maintain a tub is the same way that he felt like a government should maintain an economy. You don't just jump into the tub, but you kind of make sure before you get in there that through a policy of both adding and taking water out, you make it just at the right level. Injections, putting money into the tub, would be sort of adding water. Okay, so it's the equivalent essentially for an economy of adding spending into an economy, sort of stimulating in the GDP. Similarly, if you felt like the water level was a little low and you're kind of cold and you wanted to, or sorry, if you felt like the water was a little cold, you would add water and you would sort of pull it up. But if you were in a situation where you looked at that tub and you said, oh, that tub is almost going to spill over the edge, well, you're not going to jump into that and add new volume. What you would want to do is you would want to sort of lower the level of the tub through leakages, and in his opinion, intentional leakages, get some of that money out of the economy. And then when you jump in, obviously, to the tub or to the economy, things are a little bit easier because the level's been managed. He argued that governments have huge ability because of their power to borrow and their power to just spend quite liberally, to make a lot of these injections and leakages. And he argued that it was actually dependent upon the government to make those sorts of changes, particularly in times where the level may be far below or far above where it should be, just based on either an overgrowth period in the economy or a potential for a major recession. And so fiscal policy is essentially a tool set that sort of allows for government to use its powers to do things like spending and taxation in order to try to control the level of water in the tub, or of course, using the analogy, in the economy. Strictly defined, fiscal policy is any policy that the government uses in terms of its budgetary powers of taxation, expenditure, and borrowing in order to try to control the level of spending in the economy. And they would do that in order to try to create more demand for consumer spending, to boost employment, reduce inflation, so on and so forth. Any goal that they might have, if they can use their budgetary power to try to, achieve that goal, then you are using fiscal policy. In general, there are two major types of fiscal policy, which we'll look at individually. The first type is what you would refer to as expansionary, which is, of course, the type you would need in a major recession or depression. Typically, that involves trying to get new spending or injections into the economy in order to boost your GDP and reduce unemployment that may exist. The other type of policy that you can use would be a contractionary policy. This would be not what you would use in a depression or a recession, but rather in a period where there's maybe too much growth. And typically the goal would be, and it's usually a more moderate policy because you're not going to sort of slam it in there, but the goal would be to try to slow down output and reduce inflation a little bit. By far the most common of the two policies, just because it's a critically important one when you have emergencies, is expansionary fiscal policy. And as I mentioned, expansionary fiscal policy occurs when you're trying to increase aggregate demand using the powers that a government has to spend money. And it would sort of use those powers whenever it releases its annual budget. And that's both federal and provincial in Canada. There are two ways that this can be accomplished. The first is by increasing government spending. Okay, and essentially the idea is that if you look at that GDP equation, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, the G component is government. If the other levels are maybe a little lower than you would want, then the government can pour its own money into the economy, and that can actually boost aggregate demand directly through that sort of expenditure. When you hear about stimulus packages, or you hear about a government sort of using an action plan in a time of need, you're going to hear probably a lot about that in the weeks and months to come. That is an example that stimulus spending of expansionary fiscal policy via increasing government spending. Another tool that governments can use, which is also fiscal policy, to try to increase the GDP or aggregate demand, is reducing taxes. Now, it's a more indirect way of trying to grow the economy, but it also works because if you reduce taxes, either on businesses or on individuals, then it will tend to lead to more consumer spending, more investment spending, and thus a higher level of aggregate demand. Probably the biggest challenge with it is that when you reduce taxes, there's no guarantee that all of that money comes directly back as spending. And so who you give those reductions to is probably just as important as giving the reductions if your goal is to indirectly try to improve the economy by putting more money in people's hands so that they can use it. If you look at an expansionary fiscal policy, you can see how it looks here. And this is a properly edited and sort of, I guess, drawn version. Your price level and your GDP at the beginning of where you would want to use this policy is low. You have a goal to get to about there, which would be full employment, but you're well below that goal. And so what you would do is you would increase government spending, maybe reduce taxes, find ways of increasing the overall aggregate demand in your economy through policy. And if successful, the end result would be that you would actually, and you can see this here, and it's a properly labeled version of the graph, you would grow the GDP to its more ideal level. In doing so, and you can just assume this, you would reduce the amount of unemployment and create more jobs, and you wouldn't have to worry about a lot of inflation because inflation really isn't a problem in those low levels of GDP. It would only be a problem if you kept pushing once you got to the full employment position there. Is a government able to just push a button and go from a terrible recession like you can see with AD0 to a full employment situation like AD1 overnight? Of course not. It never happens because you're pushing way, way harder than is possible. But it doesn't mean that government can't do something. And certainly the idea of trying to get spending into the economy, not only is it beneficial in of itself, but it actually can sort of promote other kinds of spending as confidence improves and people have more money to use. And sometimes it can kind of stimulate the economy forward. The analogy you sometimes will hear people use is it's kind of like a car that has its battery that's stalled when you have a recession. The car still works, but there's no juice to actually make it move. And so how do you get that car moving? Well, you find a person who's got a battery that still has some life in it. Here, of course, would be your government that has money that it can theoretically spend. You connect the car to that car that has some juice, you give it a jolt, and then once the battery gets going, you sort of unplug it from the car that was working because the battery itself will now start to, as it runs, the car itself, as it starts to run and burns gasoline, will start to repower the battery back upwards. Same idea would be true for an economy. Stimulus hopefully starts a process of aggregate demand growth that then can become self-perpetuating. When you're looking at expansionary fiscal policy, there's some pros and cons. The pros are pretty obvious. Real GDP will rise as new equilibrium is reached. If you pour direct funds in, GDP will go up. And so that certainly is a benefit. It's going to improve things. It also, and it's fairly inevitable, you pump money into your economy, unemployment will decline so long as you're below the full employment level. It won't really change dramatically if you go over the maximum GDP at full employment, but the reality is you're not going to be stimulating at that point anyways. The negatives, there's a couple to note. One of the ones is that if you push too hard and you don't have a deep recession, there is a risk that you might overstimulate your economy. And so generally a government will want to pull back on its stimulus as it gets closer to a position where they're not in that recessionary gap, because they don't want to overstimulate and create problems by pushing too hard. The other major issue, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but that is that if you spend money as a government, you don't just spend money that comes on a tree. You have to spend money that you get from somewhere. Oftentimes you have less revenue in a recession than you normally would through your typical powers of taxation. And so less money coming in, more money going out. deficit tends to be created. And if you're not careful and you don't really manage your money when you have it, then that debt can start to build up and eventually can actually make it very hard to spend in the future. If you have too large a debt, it may be just impossible to spend more money through borrowing because you may not have the ability from your lenders to actually borrow more, given the fact that they may not trust your credit at that particular point. That was an issue Canada had started to build up in the 80s and early 90s. That was one of the reasons why they did actually have some cutbacks in that period, because they knew they kind of had to do that, or else they'd never be able to use expansionary fiscal policy again. When you're looking at fiscal policy in an expansionary fashion, it's been used famously in a few cases. One of the most famous, of course, that you've probably heard of is the New Deal. For the first few years of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, who was the Republican president, had said, you know, I feel for people. I'd like to try to help them out, but we can't be reckless as a government. We have to stand back and just let the economy run itself. He was following the logic of 100 and some odd years worth of economic thinking, which really most people would have been promoting at the time. Unfortunately, though, things just didn't get better. Confidence was so low that it wasn't really starting itself. The economy needed a boost. And so when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to the presidency in 1932 and became president in 1933, it was clear that a new approach had to be taken. FDR's approach had been the New Deal, which essentially involved government pouring huge amounts of money through public works, building roads, bridges, all kinds of different things, pouring money into the economy in order to try to get it going. Did it work? Probably not as much as the historical record would suggest, just because the amount of stimulus was actually probably not enough to really ever fully get an economy even near coming out of a major depression. But it at least turned the economy around a little bit, and most importantly, it gave confidence to the people so that the economy would at least stop collapsing on itself and would start a little bit of an upwards trajectory, even if it wasn't as large as ultimately FDR would have wanted. The other challenge for FDR, of course, was that a lot of his spending was negated by his limitations through the Constitution as president. Congress didn't always necessarily approve. The Supreme Court's often argued he didn't have the constitutional authority to make lots of the sorts of things he planned on doing through emergency means. But still, it is an important policy that set a model for governments in the future. We're probably dealing with a situation where emergency expansionary fiscal policy will be used over the next couple of months. Here you can see the Prime Minister at his home as he's in self-isolation this week, or at least the week where I made this lesson. What will that entail? Will it all be important, useful spending? Well, of course, time will tell, but it is important and necessary. And I think that's a sort of nonpartisan claim. All parties today would acknowledge, whether they're conservative or NDP or liberal, that, yeah, you need to spend money. It's when you don't have emergencies that the debates become a little bit more complex. And here you can see in peacetime or in non-emergency time, there is often the concern that with fiscal policy, if the government doesn't put the money in its spending in the right sort of place and it just sort of wastes money, then you may actually get less benefits than the costs are in terms of having to pay that back down the road. The last point I want to make is just how contractionary fiscal policy works. Contractionary fiscal policy involves governments trying to reduce aggregate demand, and you would tend to use it in a situation where you would have a need to do so, like, for example, where you had an overheated, overgrowing economy. It's pretty much the reverse of expansionary policy, in that if you want to slow down growth, you just do the opposite things. And so you can pull government spending out of the economy when you maybe don't need the stimulus as much. And you can also increase taxes, which, of course, if you increase taxes, will make it less ideal for consumers or businesses to spend money because they have less of that discretionary income. And that will end up meaning that they will tend to cut back. When you look at the graph, you can see here how it works. Again, you're starting with a picture where you're not in a recession, but you have an overgrowth period, an inflationary gap, and probably some level of inflation compared to where you would want it to be. And so the government, by cutting spending or increasing taxes, decreases aggregate demand to a more appropriate level, and then they end up at the GDP full employment position they would want, assuming that they turn the temperature down just the right way. Consequences of contractionary fiscal policy. The positive is that it does tend to have a good effect on inflation. It will reduce that if that's a problem. But it does have some drawbacks. One of them is that you have to be really careful with it, because if you contract too much, you may actually hurt your GDP and push you into a period where you have a little bit of a recession. Certainly, government doesn't want to sort of rapidly decrease spending. That would be a very dangerous thing to do. The other negative, and I've noted it here, is that it's just a politically hard thing to do. It unfortunately doesn't get used as much as Keynes would argue it should, and that's a problem. But the reason is obvious. If your government is doing really well, and there's pressures on your government to cut spending, well, people aren't going to react positively to the fact that when you have record incomes as a government and a society, you're cutting services and things that people would want. That would seem, from a knee-jerk perspective, to be contradictory and not ideal. And so what often happens is that governments, who often need to get elected every 3 or 4 years, they may, in times when things are good, not use the contractionary fiscal policy that Keynes has suggested they should. And unfortunately, then the result is that you don't pay your debts and things down in times when you can. And when you need money, if you haven't really built up a fund in a period where contractionary fiscal policy would have been more ideal, it may be more difficult. Some critics would argue that the current federal government probably should have cut back its spending a little bit more over the last few years and had a little bit more of a contractionary fiscal policy than it did. I'm not going to get into the politics of that, but that is one of the critiques that certainly more conservative type people have had of the Liberal government over the last couple of years. They haven't contracted the way that maybe a balanced Keynesian policy would suggest that they should have. Final picture that I'll show is just sort of the impact of these policies on the business cycle. Keynes's ideal or dream, because it hadn't really come to fruition in his lifetime, but it certainly did in the 20, 30 years after he died, was that while you wouldn't totally erase the business cycle with his policies, what you would do is you would definitely smooth out or make less severe the negatives, which of course everybody wants, but also you would be maybe a little bit more realistic about your expansion and make it a little bit more sort of stable, so that if there's not that major peak, the risks and the sort of risky behavior that those peaks create would be minimized, and you would have a little bit more of a smooth overall growth for the economy on the whole. Okay, well, I hope you found this interesting. Certainly it was another longer lesson, but I think an important lesson to spend a lot of time just going over points with. Your homework for tonight is as follows. Please read pages 226 to 233 in your textbook, which covers this information. And don't forget, if you don't have your textbooks, I've posted all those pages to a file in Edsby, so you can pick that off that way. And then a couple of questions, which will take up in a video tomorrow with you. Page 233, questions number 3 to 5. Please pay attention to automatic stabilizers. That's a little bit more of an important point. And then page 242, questions 2 to 3. All right, thank you.